This is the first time BMW has re-engineered the X5 suspension and brakes since 2006. I'm Alex Nelson. We've got a lot to go over. Welcome to the G05 Suspension and Brake Guide. The G05, G06, and G07, X5 through X7 share a lot of their components with the big body sedans like the 5, 6, 7, and 8 series. And you'll find a lot of similarities with the parts that I have on this table and that we'll go over on the car with those sedans. First things first, the elephant in the room, the brake packages. There's so many different brake options for these cars. It's eye-watering, not just from an ordering perspective, but when we build it out in our catalog, it's a lot to get right and make sure that you guys get the correct brakes for your car. Do us a favor and look up your option packages on your car before you order your brakes, because as you can see here, this is just the front axle of an X5, not including any other models, and there's 5 different brake rotor sizes. You have base for your 6-cylinder cars, base 6-cylinder car with third row seating. Yes, that gets a different brake rotor, front brake rotor. You have M Sport, then you have the V8 base brakes, and then you have M Performance, and there's a ton of different options given which model and trim you have across the BMW lineup. So again, please make sure you're selecting the correct brake rotor size for your application. Now, the braking packages don't just vary by their diameter. You can't just say you have the 374 or the 395 or the 348. They pretty much all have their own different thicknesses depending on the application, and therefore they have different brake pads, different applications, you name it. So if you have your brake rotor diameter, just confirm your brake rotor thickness and exactly which option package your car has. So with the elephant in the room out of the way, we can get into the nitty-gritty of this brake and suspension guide. So the G05 X5, like the one behind me, shares its componentry with a bunch of other BMWs like the X6 and the X7, as well as a couple of the sedans like the 6, 7, and 8 series. So some of these parts might look fairly familiar, as well as the quasi double wishbone suspension geometry. Right off the bat, there's a bunch of new highlights for this platform, some of which might sound familiar, some of which are totally new. In fact, they went so far off the deep end with the brake packages on these cars that you'll even find 2-piece aluminum hat rotors for these SUVs, which also have been known to make a little bit of noise. Other updates on this platform include the DSCI, or brake-by-wire system, which we'll get into later, as well as a few small odds and ends, which I'll get into on the table in front of me. And finally, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, I just want to mention that because there's so many new technologies and applications throughout this platform, there are going to be new vendors and new manufacturers for a lot of these parts that you may not have heard of. Since the G05's production start in 2018 with the 2019 model year, a whole bunch of factories and manufacturers have moved across all over different parts of the world, and names that you might be familiar with might not make a single part for these cars. So keep that in mind when you're shopping for wheel bearings, brake rotors, you name it. Now, before we head on over to our G05 and show you the way around, I want to talk about a few things you might not be familiar with on this modern BMW platform. First off is tools. Now, the wheel bearing is going to use what's called a Torx Plus socket for removal and installation, and this ensures that the tool is aligned perfectly straight each time and it doesn't round out, but these are not present in most people's toolboxes, so we wanted to make a point on that. We do have these in stock in long and short lengths at fcpeuro.com. You're also going to find these special lug nuts on a lot of X5 through X7 vehicles, as well as the 5 Series from BMW. These lug nuts were introduced with the G30, and not only do they have a 17mm hex like you'd expect, they also have a Torx socket on the head and a floating lug seat, which is super sweet if you don't want to scratch your wheels. These are a great upgrade if you want something that'll protect your wheels. They're M14 by 125, and they're very commonly featured on BMW SUVs. Another piece of hardware that you might be surprised to see in our kits is the caliper bolt. Now, previously these were basically reusable. If you've had older BMWs, you'll be familiar with undoing these, taking the caliper off, putting pads in, and doing them back up again. These days, BMW requests that these are renewed each time you take the caliper off. I know it sounds crazy, but these are actually stretch bolts. They are torque to yield, and I was kind of skeptical of the replace the bolt mentality until I torqued one of these. they're really, really tight, and you don't want that fatiguing and breaking. Something else I want to mention for this platform is the side gripping Oetiker pliers. So you might have these at home, which are typical Oetiker clamp pliers for doing up your tie rod boot clamp. Similar to the X3 we've covered previously, the tie rod will require you to get into a tight spot, and BMW has these specific Oetiker pliers with the side grip on them, so that way you can do up the boot clamp in line with the tie rod. In the X5's case, I believe it's actually up on top of the rack instead of below, like in the case of the X3. So you're going to want to keep these around, and we stock them at fcpeuro.com. Another small part that I can't show you while we're on the car, but I can show you here, is this little friction ring. Now, this was actually part of a BMW service bulletin where customers were experiencing a slight knocking or vibration in their front left or right wheel, and it was actually determined to be microscopic movement between the back of the brake rotor hat right here and the wheel hub. So they have a service bulletin where you install this little friction disc to take up that slack and make sure it doesn't vibrate or knock. We'll go ahead and link that service bulletin below, and if you experience the symptoms that are listed in that service bulletin, we stock these here at FCP Euro, and that can solve your front clunk. With all that out of the way, let's head on over to the car and take a closer look at the brake and suspension systems on the G05 X5. So as I took the wheel off, you might have seen me use this little tool here. This is an M14 by 125 wheel hanger, and it's very helpful because these wheels are the size of a small planet. So use this, don't break your back, especially if you're scrawny like me and your lower back muscles are ready to give out at any moment. So with that out of the way, we've got our hub. Now, if you've owned BMWs of old, you will be very familiar with the numbers 5 by 120. These cars are 5 by 112, and they have this giant 17mm hex bolt right here, which is one-time use, spring-loaded, and it's what holds the axle into the wheel bearing. So the reason for that 17mm hex is because of this axle design right here. Now, this doesn't just look like a sandworm in order to be scary. This is actually because it prevents axles from getting seized into the wheel hub, or at least that's the idea. So the axle shaft at the end of it has a spline which mates up to this right here, and then this massive spring-loaded bolt goes through the middle and holds that axle in place. So that's what you're seeing right there. Now, something that definitely hasn't changed is this 6mm brake rotor set screw, which loves to seize and strip out because they're made of steel and it's a 6mm hex. We have gone through the trouble of remaking this set screw in stainless steel with a T40 Torx bit so that way it doesn't corrode, and when the time comes to remove it, it's a Torx which won't strip. So check these out over on fcpeuro.com to save yourself or future you some headache. Now, outside of the hub itself, you of course have your ginormous brake disc, which, as I said in the intro, can vary in thickness, so make sure you pay attention to that. These calipers, just like on an X3M or an M40i car, are kind of a phony. They have these wings which don't actually have anything in them. I'm touching the brake rotor right now. These are 4-piston, and the pad is about yay big, so they're not the massive pads that you'd find on an M car or an X5M. Keep that in mind when you're shopping for M Sport or M Performance brake pads. So if you're familiar with working on BMWs with a McPherson strut suspension, this will look very different, and that's because this is a quasi double wishbone setup. It's not really a true double wishbone because while your upper wishbone is in fact a wishbone, the lower one is actually split into two arms, your front tension strut and your control arm, which we'll show you in a minute. I do want to touch on the way that this upper wishbone mounts to the body. It has some specific fasteners which are one-time use, and you'll find those in our front suspension refresh kits. Now, just behind that is the air spring, and this style of air spring all the way around on an X5 is new for the G05, and we'll touch more on that when we head to the back of the car. So with everything just behind the wheel out of the way, let's head underneath and I'll show you the most common failure item on any BMW SUV. So now that we're underneath the car, I can show you a little bit around this quasi double wishbone suspension. So of course, at the top, you have your main upper wishbone, which looks like a conventional wishbone. Underneath, however, as I said, this is split into two arms. So you have your control arm, the one that is transverse from the car, and then you have this diagonal arm, which is called the tension strut. Now, when you hit bumps or you go over rough terrain or you accelerate and brake, the wheel is trying to move forward and backwards relative to the car. Now, as you can probably imagine, this control arm, which is mounted transverse to the body, and that upper wishbone aren't really the ones taking the brunt of that force. The one that's managing most of it is this tension strut right here. So as you can imagine, the front bushing in this tension strut and the ball joint fail quite a bit. In fact, if you take a random sample of 40 G05 X5 VINs, throw them into BMW's dealer service history, 15 of them before 80,000 miles will pretty much certainly have this replaced due to customer complaints. At least that's our data. Now, if you want to make replacing this a little bit cheaper and a little bit less painful for future you can do a Mila upgrade. And there's actually an alternative that is even less expensive than buying this complete Mila arm. Now, as I mentioned, this front tension strut takes a ton of abuse. It takes all the forces of accelerating and stopping, and that leads to this front bushing failing. And on the OEM arm, that actually leads to leaks because it is a oil-filled bushing. Now, Mila actually has two alternatives to just buying this very expensive genuine arm that will leak again, and we've got that installed here on our G05 X5 with this steel Mila HD arm, which features an all-rubber front bushing. They even did you one better, and they've got the bushing sold separately. So if you want to replace the bushing instead of rebuying an entire Mila HD arm or the entire genuine arm, you can just install this Mila rubber bushing, which also eliminates the chance of a oil-filled bushing rupturing and leaking all over your driveway. Of all these suspension parts on a G05 X5 all the way through to the X7, the XM, and the sedans which feature this quasi-double wishbone suspension, this tension strut is the most commonly replaced part across the board on all of those platforms as far as the suspension and braking system goes. Keep an eye out for it. If your steering feels a little bit vague, or you have a front clunk, or you see the wheel moving back and forth when someone parks your car, it's probably that front tension strut bushing. Now, speaking of other bushings that can go bad, the upper wishbone, as I mentioned, is a true wishbone, and this ball joint right here has a tendency to go bad. In fact, our BMW product manager, Gareth, recently on his G05, this ball joint had a ton of play in it, and it was causing a suspension knock, so he replaced it. You probably won't feel this in the accuracy of the steering all that much. It'll typically just show up as a knock or a clunk in the front suspension. This tension strut, however, majorly affects how the car will drive. Now, I mentioned that this Mila upgraded tension strut is steel. They also sell a control arm, which is steel, and I should note that it does have this counterweight on it, which actually has its own torque to yield or one-time use bolt. It's a serious counterweight with a serious torque. I think there is probably some pretty gnarly vibrations that they were trying to cancel out with that. So please reinstall this when you're servicing your suspension. And it goes without saying that these Mila replacements are an affordable alternative to the genuine parts if you don't want to spend an arm and a leg servicing the suspension on your X5 or X6 or X7 or XM or 5 Series, 6 Series, 7 Series, or 8 Series. Right here is where that extended length Torx Plus 60 socket will go. You're going to need this in order to service the wheel bearings. The wheel bearing is held on by 4 TP60 bolts right here, and this can reach past the boot. Slot in right there, you heard that positive engagement on the Torx Plus. Make sure that it won't strip and it can take a ton of torque. It's a little bit difficult to get in there. Make sure you grab one of these special tools. Now, it's small, but it is definitely worth mentioning here, these sway bar end link ball joints, which are prone to failure. Now, those can lead you chasing a clunk in the suspension to the point where you've replaced every single suspension part, and it's this silly little cheap sway bar end link that's actually failed. I did that exact same thing on my G12 7 Series, which shares a similar suspension design to this. Replaced a control arm, wishbone, tension strut, didn't fix it, and it was just this small little sway bar end link. So make sure you check for play in that if you have a clunk. Right next to that is this super interesting lower strut mount. If you're familiar with BMWs of old, you'll know that the strut typically goes into the front wheel upright where the wheel bearing is mounted to. In these cars, it's actually a separate part. The bottom of the strut gets pinched into this aluminum brace here, and then that comes down and separately mounts to the lower control arm, which is what kind of completes that double wishbone design. So with the nitty-gritty of the front end out of the way, let's head to the back and I'll show you some new stuff for this platform. Now, coming to the back of the X5, things look pretty conventional, but there's actually some huge changes that are going to greatly affect the maintenance cost and the serviceability of this rear end as compared to previous X5s. Now, starting off with the hub and the brake again, we've got that 17mm hex, just like the front, as well as a 66 center bore and a 5x112 bolt pattern. This is pretty appreciated. X5 vets will know that there used to be different hub bores front and rear for the M model, so it's nice that they stuck with the same all the way around here. The brake packages, again, are extremely confusing, and there's a bunch of different brake packages for the rear axle as well, depending on the package, depending on the model. They even have packages where the rear brakes are actually bigger than the front, which is kind of bizarre. And many of them use this single piston floating caliper on the bracket with the electronic parking brake bolted to the backside. There's a little bit of a trick with that electronic parking brake. You can either use a scanning tool to reset it, or you can grab a long, sometimes double hinge needle nose pliers, stick it in the two little grooves on the side of the piston and twist. Just be sure not to damage that boot. That will also allow you to retract that caliper when you're doing your brakes. Now, these are actually so universal that BMW labels on the caliper the size range that they're used for, because they're used on so many different applications. And in fact, if you have base front brakes that aren't rigid mounted like our M Sport brakes on this car, it'll have the same brake size information on the front, which can be very helpful for determining your brake sizes. Now, I'm going to move on to the stuff that's not so fun, and that is the rear suspension layout and rear air struts on this generation of BMW. Now, conventionally, or typically in previous generations, you had a divorced air spring setup where the air spring looked something like this, and then you had your strut mounted separately, which made both replacing the strut or replacing the airbag very, very easy. They didn't have to be done at the same time, and when these failed, they can be replaced very inexpensively and very quickly. In order to improve the rear ride quality of the X5, which if you've driven an F15 or an E70, which are both pretty much the same car underneath, you'll know the rear end is pretty pogo-y. In order to improve that rear ride quality, they went to a full U-shaped airbag over suspension strut design. And this means while it's all in one piece, it's very expensive and quite a bit more difficult to service and remove compared to the old school divorced bag spring and strut style. Now, not only is this more complicated and more expensive, you might not recognize the companies that actually make this for BMW or sell the OEM manufactured parts on the aftermarket. So if you see a brand you're not familiar with, it's because a lot of the technology back here actually has changed and evolved over the years. After all, the F15, which preceded this, was actually just based on the E70, so there's been a lot of development in the suspension world between when BMW first came out with their air suspension systems on their X5s and now. Moving inwards from that air strut, the evolution continues. We no longer have an integral link on the rear end of the X5 where you have an arm with another link that goes in between the arm and the upper strut. Now it is full multi-link with super, super long and beefy suspension arms. This is a very similar multi-link setup to what you'd find on any other G chassis BMW, whether it be a G20 sedan or a G16 8 Series. The bummer about this setup is that something like the camber arm on the bottom here actually doesn't feature any bushings in it whatsoever. The arm is just a stamped piece of steel. In order to replace those bushings, you will need to take them out of the subframe and out of the knuckle, which obviously will involve special tools, and access might be a bit of a pain. The rear air suspension, especially on adaptive suspension vehicles which have different damping rates, is so expensive that if you come across a car that has a leaking rear airbag, you might need to consider actually walking away from the deal. They're that expensive. The good news is, at least from the data that we've seen, the rear suspension arms and rear bushings, along with the subframe bushings on G05 X5s, X6s, and X7s, rarely go bad, and we rarely see a customer complaint of a rear suspension clunk in BMW dealer data. So that's good. All you have to worry about really are those air suspension struts. The good news is BMW actually offered this car with steel all the way around, so if you get a base model B58 car, love that engine, it actually might come with the most reliable suspension option, and you really might not be sacrificing that much ride comfort, considering that one of the modes from the suspension is Sport, which very few people are actually using day to day. Before we move on from the rear suspension of the G05, I want to point out a couple things that would influence my purchasing decision if I were in the market for one of these cars, an F15 or a G05. The first thing I noticed that I really like is the aluminum rear subframe. That is a huge deal, especially if you live in the Northeast, Pacific Northwest, Midwest. The fact that the subframe can't rust is a game changer on an SUV that you're probably planning on driving year-round. So I absolutely love that. Also, aside from that lower camber arm, basically every single other suspension arm features bushings included in it, so it's pretty easy to replace if you do get a suspension clunk. Aside from that lower camber arm, as I mentioned, the bushings are in the knuckle and the subframe. There is quite a bit of bracing. It's worth pointing out that much of the hardware that's used across this car is one-time use, and it's worth respecting that rule because we, even on our own G05, have experienced bolts stretching, galling the threads, and actually ruining the part that they're attached to. So, not just saying this because I work here and I advise buying parts from us, but it can actually lead to a pretty rough day if a bolt stretches more than it's intended to, breaks on the car while on the public road, or totals out a part that you've just ordered for the car. Everything I've covered here should be fairly familiar if you've worked on a relatively modern car, but there's something that has been a bit of a secret to us DIYers, and that is brake-by-wire. So we're going to wrap up here, head back to the front of the car, and I want to show you some ins and outs of the DSCI system by Bosch. All G05 X5s and many of the other BMW G chassis, especially the more premium vehicles, got this system. You'll find it, if you have it, in the front left corner of the vehicle. It's under this little cover. If you remove this and you still have a donut-shaped brake booster, that means you don't have DSCI. You just have DSC, which is going to work like any other conventional brake system. This, you'll notice, does not have the big donut, so this is DSCI. And on the inside of the pump unit itself, you'll see this little silver motor shape, and that is actually a motor which turns a screw, and it has its own master cylinder inside, which can be pushed forward by a screw. So that's why the construction looks like that. So now that you know where to find it to see if your car has brake-by-wire, let's go to the table and I'll explain how it all works. So how does DSCI work, and what should you look out for when you're servicing a car like the X5 that has DSCI? Well, the premise is that there's no physical connection between the brake pedal and the brake caliper. That's only really partially true. The DSCI system has a series of solenoid valves, so it can control pressure at every single wheel. It also has a motor with a screw on it and a brake piston, basically a brake master cylinder, which can advance and force fluid through any one of those circuits. It also has something that's very interesting called a simulator valve. This is literally a faux master cylinder to give you brake feedback on the pedal as if you were pushing a traditional brake booster or brake master cylinder. Now, the reason that I mentioned it's only partially true that there's no physical connection is because if all of the above fails and the electrical systems go haywire and the motor doesn't operate, there's actually a valve which opens to convert that simulator valve that gives you that force feedback into the actual brake master cylinder, albeit with very little braking power compared to when you have power brakes. Now, if all this sounds super complicated, it is, but it's intended to provide a lot of safety benefits. One of which being, if you turn the windshield wipers on, it actually dries the brake pads by brushing them against the rotors, making sure that they're dry and ready for the next stop. One of the more important safety features it has, and probably the reason for it existing, is that if you lose brake pressure at a specific wheel, it'll actually cut off that circuit from the rest of them, giving you normal braking performance at the other 3 corners, or the other 2 corners, or at just 1 corner. Now, these safety features are great except for when they backfire when you're servicing the braking system. People have been left with a bricked braking system or permanent error stored in their DSCI system after servicing the brakes or bleeding their system. And I'm going to show you some tricks that BMW suggests will allow you to work around these safety systems. Now, before I explain how to correctly service a system with DSCI, I need to explain how the emergency brake works in a system with a brake-by-wire booster. When you pull the emergency brake in a car with the DSCI module like the X5 behind me, the DSCI motor and the piston will actually pressurize all 4 brake circuits, or at least the ones that it knows aren't leaking, and that's what will bring the car to a stop before it actually applies the screw parking brake in the rear caliper. Now, when you're at rest or you're on the side of a street and you pull that parking brake lever, it's actually doing that same math. It's just doing it and realizing the car is already stopped, does it in an instant, and then it advances that parking brake. BMW suggests that you can use this feature to correctly service the brakes. Now, what I mean by that is if you were to put pads on a car that has a reduced rotor thickness, aka pad slapping a car, or you were to bleed the brakes and then go to press the brake pedal in order to bleed the system will think that there is a leak because the pistons and the fluid required to make up that distance or make up the slack that's been created is basically what the system would see if there was a fluid loss. This is what will cause the error codes and what will brick the DSCI module. BMW suggests that, per the aforementioned parking brake functionality, by not touching the brake pedal, getting in the car after a brake service, pulling the emergency brake or parking brake lever, and letting the system set the brake pads itself, this will prevent any error codes when you service your brake system. Another thing that BMW has pointed out is that the key can be a source of frustration with this automated braking system. Basically, the DSCI module will perform a pressure check, a fluid loss check, when the car is in its ready-to-drive state, basically when you walk by with the key. If you've ever walked up to your G chassis BMW and heard the fuel pump prime when you walk up with the key, you'll know that the car is doing a heck of a lot when it detects that that key is in proximity. BMW suggests that if you're bleeding the brakes or really servicing any component of the braking system, you should take the key away from the car and keep it away from the car. By walking back with the key, let's say during a brake bleeding procedure, you could energize the DSCI module and it might check for leaks. In fact, while we were pulling off the covers to show you where the DSCI module is located, I actually heard the thing priming and checking for leaks. Make sure that you keep the key away from the vehicle while bleeding your brakes or servicing the brake pads, because you could end up in a situation where the car recognizes it as a fluid loss, you get a permanent error stored in your DSCI module, and you have to bring it to the dealership for them to clear the codes. So all of this is to make sure that you can service your brakes without any issue, and those kits are available at fcpeuro.com. We carry them in stock for just about every trim you can imagine for the braking systems on these cars, and please do make sure that you pay attention to the option package on your specific X5 or other G chassis BMW. So now that you know the ins and outs of how the suspension and braking systems on your G05 or other G chassis BMW works, we hope you found this suspension and brake guide for the G05 helpful, and be sure to shop our in-stock G05 brake and suspension parts over on fcpeuro.com. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and please let me know if there's anything I missed on the G05, G06, G07 platform. I'm Alex Nelson. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.